Hi, I'm Hannah Armstrong, and this is Utah Lake History, a thriving ecological and cultural ecosystem. Utah Lake rests in Utah Valley, which was home to the Timpanogos tribe of Native Americans. The Timpanogos tribe are one of the many clans of the Shoshone Nation, covering much of Utah, Nevada, Idaho, Oregon, and Wyoming, known as the Great Basin. Land east of Utah Lake was used as a ceremonial site for the clans to come together for an annual fish festival, along with the Timpanogos Mountain and Cave being sacred sites. The Timpanogos tribe lived on the shores of Utah Lake. In the 1700s, the tribe was visited by Spanish explorers and later by traders and trappers, who they shared a productive economic relationship with by establishing trades and bartering for resources. Until 1847, when Mormons entered the Salt Lake Valley and discontentment began. The noble chief Wakara, one of the 8 grandsons of the royal bloodline of the Timpanogos, warned that Brigham Young was not allowed to settle on the land, but Brigham Young assured him that they were only going to stay for the winter, until they could move on to California. When spring came and settlements, fences claiming land, and forts started to be built, especially Fort Utah on the banks of the Provo River near Utah Lake, Chief Wakara was betrayed. In 1849, the Mormon Church commanded the removal of the Indian people from their land. Battle Creek was the first massacre of Timpanogos by Mormons a month after, which foretold years of confrontations, battles, wars, and death as the settlers devastated Indians' ways of life and their rights to the land, water, and game, causing starvation and disease. By 1865, a population of 70,000 Timpanogos Indians dwindled to 2,300 after extended violence perpetrated, and U.S. federal troops forced them from their homes in the mountains by gunpoint to the barren Uinta Reservation. The Mormon population was about 180,000 at that time. A peace treaty was signed in 1872, and in 1892, Utah became a state. The history of Utah is embedded in this conflict and settler colonialism. The Indians' main source of food was the abundant fish population in the Utah Lake. The fish were so abundant that it was the main source of food for settlers as well, but they overfished during the spawning season due to it being their only food source, since their crops had failed due to crickets and winter frost. With the introduction of agriculture, many irrigation canals were created to drain water from the lake for nearby farms. This became a problem as fish who once swam up the Provo River to spawn became confused and would swim up the irrigation canals instead. When the canals would be closed off, the water would empty and the massive fish kills would occur. In the 1900s, fish were the main export of the Utah Valley, with 13 licensed fishing companies working on the lakes and rivers. Workers constructing Mormon temples were paid in fish from the lake. Recreation and tourism turned the lake into a site of play, relaxation at beachside resorts, and water sports. But the unregulated pollution of the lake by sewage and nearby metal industries quickly polluted the water. Like the Geneva Steel Mill, which was built in the 1940s, it was shown that the steel mill polluted the lake more than the raw sewage being emptied into the lake and tributaries. Early legislation forced farmers to put screens on their irrigation canals. Wastewater treatment facilities were put into place to stop the sewage problem as diseases started to be spread by the lake water. It wasn't until the Clean Water Act of the 1970s that efforts were made to clean up the lake. Reclamation actions have been undertaken from that time period, but the public perception of a gross lake has persisted. Invasive carp were introduced to the lake to replace the dwindling trout, and that disrupted the ecosystem as their population exploded. Utah Lake used to be the home of 13 species found nowhere else in the world. Now it's home to only 2, the June sucker and the Utah sucker. Since the introduction of the carp in the lake, the vegetation has decreased drastically, and since it is a shallow lake, dirt is picked up by the waves and muddies the water. The June sucker recovery program necessitates the removal of the carp. The June Sucker Recovery Implementation Program has worked to remove 29 million pounds of carp, a fish that has caused much damage to the Utah Lake. Here is a demonstration of their winter fishing process.
A lot of people wonder how we fish year-round on Utah Lake because sometimes we get ice. We can actually chop holes in ice, get nets underneath the ice, and how we actually bring the fish out and are able to harvest them.
When our crews go out and fish through the ice, Bill Loy, he's been fishing the lake for years, goes out on the ice, and during our pilot study, he actually teamed up with Jeff Riedemann out of Minnesota, a commercial fisherman from there. They came out and fished actually through the ice. What that involves is cutting a series of holes in the ice in kind of a semicircular line, dropping the net, threading it through each hole. They then retrieve the net, bring it back to a large hole, and basically bring all the fish out through that larger hole.
Interesting. Hopefully, with the removal of carp and other restoration projects, including the obstruction of housing development on the lake, it can return to the glory of its ancestry as a thriving hub of abundance and community. Thank you.